September 1942. On a narrow, muddy track carved into the spine of the Owen Stanley Mountains, a Japanese soldier named Ogawa Masatsugu stumbles forward. He is an elite member of the South Seas Detachment, a veteran of victorious campaigns across Asia. But here, in the suffocating green hell of New Guinea, victory feels like a distant dream. He hasn't eaten a full meal in weeks. His uniform is a tattered rag. His body is racked with dysentery, and his comrades are skeletal figures, ghosts haunting the jungle. Through a break in the canopy, under the oppressive tropical haze, he can see them. Distant, tantalizing lights. The lights of Port Moresby. They have made it. After months of unimaginable hardship, fighting their way over the mountains, they are within striking distance of their final objective. This is the moment of triumph. But then, an order arrives, passed down a line of starving, exhausted men. It is unbelievable, incomprehensible. The order is not to attack. The order is to retreat, to turn around and march back into the same green hell that has consumed them. Why? Why, at the very gates of victory, did an entire Japanese army, an army that had seemed invincible, simply stop and turn back? The conventional story tells us of heroic Australian resistance, of a David and Goliath struggle in the jungle. And while that is true, it is not the whole truth. It is not the deepest truth. The real story of the Kokoda Track Campaign is not simply a story of men fighting men. It is the story of two armies fighting a third, far more powerful enemy, the jungle itself. And the central thesis of this campaign, the lesson written in blood and mud from Kokoda to Port Moresby, is this. The battle for New Guinea was not decided by tactics or courage or even firepower. It was decided by logistics. The Japanese advance was not a military operation. It was a race against starvation, and they were about to lose. This is the story of how an empire's ambition was broken not by a decisive battle, but by the brutal, simple mathematics of an overstretched supply line. This is the autopsy of an impossible campaign. In early 1942, the world held its breath as the sun of the Japanese Empire rose to its zenith. The news was a relentless drumbeat of Allied defeat. Hong Kong had fallen. Malaya had been overrun. The supposedly impregnable fortress of Singapore, the very symbol of British power in the East, had surrendered in a shocking humiliation. The American fleet lay in ruins at Pearl Harbor, and its forces in the Philippines were locked in a desperate, doomed struggle on the Bataan Peninsula. The Japanese military seemed unstoppable, a perfectly honed blade slicing through the Pacific. They were portrayed as masters of jungle warfare, superhuman soldiers who could live off the land, materialize from the foliage, and fight with a fanaticism that defied Western comprehension. For Australia, this was not a distant war. It was a terrifying reality closing in on its doorstep. With the fall of Singapore, the last major buffer was gone. The Japanese bombing of Darwin in February 1942 brought the war home in the most visceral way imaginable. Invasion seemed not just possible, but imminent. A deep, primal fear gripped the nation. The problem was, Australia was dangerously exposed. Its finest fighting men, the seasoned veterans of the Australian Imperial Force, or AIF, were thousands of miles away. They were fighting Rommel's Africa Corps in the deserts of North Africa, garrisoning Syria and facing the Japanese in Malaya. Prime Minister John Curtin had pleaded with Winston Churchill to bring these hardened divisions home, but Britain, facing its own existential crisis, was reluctant to release them. So, for the defense of its own territory, and the vital protectorate of New Guinea just to its north, Australia had to rely on what it had left: the militia. These were citizen soldiers, conscripts and volunteers, often young, undertrained, and under-equipped. To the professional soldiers of the AIF, they were known by a derogatory nickname: Chocos, or chocolate soldiers. The implication was cruel but clear. In the heat of battle, they would melt away. It was a deeply unfair label, a reflection of inter-service snobbery rather than reality, but it stuck. And it was these so-called chocolate soldiers who would be the first line of defense against the most feared army in the world. The strategic prize was an island that few Australians could find on a map: New Guinea. Specifically, a small, humid port town on its southern coast called Port Moresby. From a map, Port Moresby looks insignificant. In 1942, it was the key to the entire Southwest Pacific. For the Japanese, capturing it would sever the crucial supply lines between the United States and Australia, isolating the continent and effectively neutralizing it as an Allied base. From airfields at Port Moresby, Japanese bombers could dominate the Coral Sea and strike at will across the northern coast of Australia, paving the way for a potential invasion. For the Allies, holding Port Moresby was non-negotiable. It was the final bastion, the last line in the sand. General Douglas MacArthur, having famously fled the Philippines, had established his new headquarters in Brisbane, Australia. He knew that the defense of Australia began in the mountains of New Guinea. The Japanese High Command knew it too. Their first attempt to take Port Moresby was by sea. In May of 1942, an invasion fleet steamed south, only to be intercepted by the U.S. Navy in the Battle of the Coral Sea. It was a tactical draw, but a strategic Allied victory. The seaborne invasion was repulsed. The Japanese would have to find another way. Their eyes turned to a map, to a thin, almost invisible line that snaked its way over the towering, razor-backed Owen Stanley Mountains, a native footpath known as the Kokoda Trail. Their plan was audacious, almost insane: land an army on the north coast of New Guinea and march them directly over the mountains to seize Port Moresby from the landward side. It was a feat of military engineering and endurance that no modern army had ever attempted. And the men they chose for the job were the elite of the Imperial Japanese Army, the South Seas Detachment, commanded by Major General Tomitaro Horii. These were not conscripts. They were hardened veterans, confident and flush with victory. Their objective was clear. Their resolve was absolute. And standing in their way were a few hundred Australian chocolate soldiers. On the night of July 21st, 1942, under the cover of darkness, the first wave of Japanese landing craft grated against the beaches near the villages of Gona and Buna on New Guinea's northern coast. Over 2,000 troops of the South Seas Detachment splashed ashore, a formidable force of infantry, engineers, and artillery. They were the tip of a spear aimed directly at the heart of the Allied position in the south. Their commander, General Horii, wasted no time. An advance unit was immediately sent inland, tasked with scouting the trail and securing the forward village of Kokoda, with its crucial dirt airstrip. The first domino was about to fall. The initial Australian presence in the area was little more than a tripwire. A small, unprepared patrol from the Papuan Infantry Battalion and the 39th Militia Battalion ran headlong into the Japanese advance guard. The clash was brief and brutal. The Australians, hopelessly outnumbered, scattered and fell back towards the small administrative post of Kokoda. The commander of the Australian forces in the area was Lieutenant Colonel William Owen. He was a man who understood the gravity of the situation. Hearing of the Japanese landing, he rushed forward from Port Moresby with every man he could muster, a piecemeal force from his 39th Battalion. He knew Kokoda and its airstrip were the key. If he could hold it, reinforcements and supplies could be flown in. If he lost it, his men would be stranded, forced into a desperate fighting retreat through some of the worst terrain on Earth. By July 29th, he had managed to gather a meager force of just 77 soldiers on a ridge overlooking the Kokoda airstrip. They were exhausted, digging frantically into the earth to create firing pits and machine gun nests. They were the Chacos, the inexperienced militia, about to face the hardened veterans of the Imperial Japanese Army. They didn't have to wait long. As darkness fell, the jungle erupted. Around 400 Japanese soldiers, masters of the night attack, charged up the slope. They screamed war cries as they ran, a terrifying psychological weapon meant to shatter the nerve of the defenders. Grenades arced through the humid air. The 77 Australians of B Company opened up with everything they had. Bren guns, rifles, grenades, stitching the darkness with tracers and turning the ridge into a cauldron of noise and violence. But the Japanese were relentless. Experienced in infiltration, they closed the distance with terrifying speed. The fight devolved into a primal hand-to-hand struggle in the mud and darkness. Bayonets, rifle butts, fists. It was brutal, personal, and utterly chaotic. Colonel Owen was in the thick of it, moving from position to position, trying to steady his men. In the confusion, a Japanese sniper's bullet found him. He was shot through the head, collapsing into a rifle pit. His medical officer, Captain Jeffrey Vernon, scrambled to his side with stretcher bearers. They found Owen alive, but only just. Part of his brain was exposed, and he was muttering incoherently. The scene, as later described by an assistant, Jack Wilkinson, was surreal. Japanese soldiers were whispering in the grass just feet away. They carried their dying commander to a small cabin serving as a first aid post. Wilkinson held up a lantern for the captain, but each time the light flickered on, a burst of machine gun fire would rip through the thin walls. It was hopeless. Within 15 minutes, Lieutenant Colonel Owen was dead. The loss of their commander, coupled with the sheer ferocity of the assault, broke the Australian line. They began a fighting withdrawal, pulling back towards the next defensible position at Diniki. They took most of their heavy weapons, but the Japanese had won the first round. They had captured the Kokoda airstrip. Yet, even in defeat, a legend was born. Private Snowy Pyrao, a young Bren gunner, was one of the last to leave. Devastated by Owen's death, he refused to flee with the others. Instead, he found a hiding spot on the edge of the rubber plantation and waited. As dawn broke, he saw a group of about 20 Japanese soldiers celebrating their victory, gathered in the open. When they were perfectly in range, he squeezed the trigger, emptying a full magazine into the group. He cut them all down before melting back into the jungle. It was a small act of defiance, but it was a sign of what was to come. The first clash was over. The Japanese had taken Kokoda, but they had paid a price. 95 casualties. More importantly, they had made a critical intelligence failure. They reported to their headquarters that they had engaged and defeated a force of over 1,000 men. They had no idea they had been held at bay for hours and bled so heavily by just 77 chocolate soldiers. The myth of the invincible Japanese warrior had just met the reality of the stubborn Australian defender. The battle for the Kokoda Trail had begun. This was the inciting incident, the event that shattered the fragile peace and set in motion a chain of events that would become one of the most brutal campaigns of the entire Pacific War. The fall of Kokoda sent a shockwave back to Port Moresby. The abstract threat was now a clear and present danger, a determined enemy pushing south over the mountains. The initial Australian response was a frantic, ill-conceived attempt to immediately retake the village. It ended in a bloody failure. an ambush that underscored the Japanese skill and the unforgiving nature of the terrain. The grim reality set in. This would not be a quick fight. It would be a desperate, grinding retreat. And so began the autopsy of the Japanese advance. On the surface, it looked like a string of stunning victories. The Australians were pushed back from Kokoda to Diniki, then from Diniki to Isarava. Every time the Australians dug in, the Japanese, superior in numbers and buoyed by their warrior code, would eventually find a way to flank them, forcing another painful withdrawal. The fighting was nightmarish, taking place on a trail often no wider than a single man, flanked by impenetrable jungle walls. The Battle of Isarava in late August became the defining moment of this fighting retreat. Here, the exhausted 39th Battalion was finally reinforced by veteran AIF troops from the 21st Brigade. The Chacos and the Diggers now fought side by side. The sight that greeted the veterans was shocking. The militiamen were gaunt, clad in rags, their bodies ravaged by malaria and dysentery, yet still fighting. The respect was immediate and total. The slur chocolate soldiers died forever in the mud of Isarava. For 4 days, about 1,800 Australians held off nearly 6,000 Japanese in some of the most intense fighting of the campaign. The noise was constant, a hellish symphony of machine gun fire, mortar explosions, and the crack of bullets tearing through the triple canopy jungle. Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Honor of the 39th described lanes of destruction carved through the trees by gunfire. The combat was often intimate and savage. A Japanese soldier lassoed an Australian with a vine and tried to drag him into the undergrowth before the Australian cut himself free and stabbed his attacker in the eye. Bodies piled up in front of the Bren gun positions, but still the Japanese came on, driven forward by officers with drawn swords. It was at Isarava that Private Bruce Kingsbury earned the first Victoria Cross, awarded on Australian territory. When a Japanese breakthrough threatened his battalion's headquarters, Kingsbury, on his own initiative, seized a Bren gun and charged forward, firing from the hip directly into the enemy. He broke their attack and saved the position, but was cut down by a sniper's bullet. His selfless act of supreme courage became a symbol of the Australian spirit on the trail. Despite such heroism, the sheer weight of Japanese numbers was too much. The Australians were forced to fall back again, and again, from Isarava to Eora Creek, to Templeton's Crossing, to Brigade Hill. Each position was a new battle, each retreat a new struggle for survival. But as the Australians were being pushed back, something else was happening. A hidden, far more decisive battle was being waged, a battle of logistics. This is the twist in the story of Kokoda. This is the truth that is the opposite of the myth. With every step the Australians took backward, they were falling closer to their main supply base at Port Moresby. Their supply line was shortening. With every step the Japanese took forward, they were stretching their own supply line to the breaking point. General Horiai had made a catastrophic miscalculation. He had believed the promises of his staff that the Kokoda Trail could sustain an army on the march. He believed his men, in their superior spirit, could live off the land. He was disastrously wrong. The jungle provided nothing. There was no food to forage. The local villagers, terrified, had fled. Every single bullet, every grain of rice, every medical bandage had to be physically carried on the backs of men from the landing beaches at Gona and Buna. The Japanese supply chain was a thin, fragile thread of human porters, struggling up near vertical slopes, wading through chest-deep rivers, and sinking into knee-deep mud. It was a system doomed to fail. While the Australian forward troops were starving, airdrops, however inaccurate, were bringing them some supplies. They also had the invaluable help of the local Papuan and New Guinean people, who the soldiers affectionately nicknamed the Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels. These men performed miracles, carrying massive loads of ammunition and supplies up the trail, and, most famously, carrying the wounded and sick back down with incredible care and compassion. They were a logistical asset the Japanese simply did not have. The Japanese soldiers' diary entries from this period tell the real story. The triumphant proclamations of duty to the emperor give way to desperate daily entries about one thing: food. A single cup of rice per day, then half a cup, then nothing. They were reduced to eating roots, leaves, anything they could find. Dysentery swept through their ranks, a debilitating disease that left men too weak to walk, let alone fight. Malaria, scrub typhus, and tropical ulcers added to their misery. The elite South Seas detachment was being systematically destroyed, not by Australian bullets, but by starvation and disease. Their combat effectiveness was plummeting with every mile they advanced. The ripple effect of this logistical collapse was profound. By mid-September, the Japanese vanguard had fought its way to Yorubaiwa Ridge. From here, they could finally see the lights of Port Moresby. They were just 25 miles away. It should have been their moment of ultimate triumph. Instead, it was the moment of their ultimate failure. General Hori looked at his army and saw not a triumphant force, but a collection of walking skeletons. They had the will to take Port Moresby, but they no longer had the physical strength. And then, the final domino fell, not from the front, but from the rear. The Japanese High Command in Rabaul, now bogged down in a desperate struggle with the U.S. Marines on an island called Guadalcanal, looked at the situation in New Guinea and made a cold, hard calculation. They could not sustain two major campaigns. The Kokoda offensive had stalled, its supply lines were non-existent, and its men were starving. The order was given. General Hori was to halt his advance and conduct a strategic withdrawal. For the soldiers on Yorubaiwa Ridge, staring at the lights of their prize, the order was a soul-crushing blow. They had endured hell for nothing. The great Japanese advance was over. Now, the ripple effect would become a tidal wave. The Australians, now reinforced with fresh brigades and with their supply lines secure, went on the offensive. The hunters became the hunted. The retreat down the Kokoda Trail had been a nightmare. The Japanese retreat back up it was an atrocity. The Australians pursued them relentlessly, attacking their rear guards at Iora Creek and Oivigorari. But mostly, they found an enemy that was no longer capable of fighting. They found Japanese soldiers who had died of starvation where they fell on the track. They found evidence of cannibalism among the desperate, starving troops. General Hori himself, attempting to escape by raft, drowned in a swollen river. The once proud South Seas detachment ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. It had been utterly consumed by the jungle it had tried to conquer. The autopsy was complete. The cause of death was not a single fatal wound, but a slow, agonizing death by starvation and exhaustion, brought on by the fatal disease of logistical arrogance. By January 1943, the battle for the Kokoda Trail was over. The last Japanese resistance on the northern beaches at Buna, Gona, and Sanananda was extinguished in a final, bloody confrontation. The threat to Australia had been eliminated, but the cost was immense. Over 600 Australians had been killed on the trail itself, and thousands more were wounded or struck down by tropical diseases. The Japanese losses were catastrophic. Of the more than 13,000 soldiers General Hori led into New Guinea, fewer than 5,000 survived. The vast majority died not in combat, but from starvation and sickness. In the grand scheme of the Second World War, with its colossal battles involving millions of men, the Kokoda Campaign was a small affair. It was fought by brigades, not armies. But its significance cannot be measured in numbers alone. Kokoda was a profound, nation-defining moment for Australia. It was the first time the country had faced a direct, existential threat on its own doorstep, and it had fought and won, largely on its own. The campaign forged a new chapter in the Australian identity, one built on endurance, sacrifice, and a quiet, stubborn resilience in the face of impossible odds. The chocolate soldiers, who had gone into the jungle as boys, emerged as legends, their bravery forever silencing the doubters. The trail itself became sacred ground, a symbol of the nation's coming of age, much like Gallipoli had been for a previous generation. But zooming out further, beyond the national pride and the poignant memorials, the story of Kokoda leaves us with a timeless and universal lesson about the nature of warfare itself. It is a brutal confirmation of an old military axiom, often attributed to generals from Napoleon to Patton. Amateurs talk about tactics, but professionals study logistics. The Japanese war machine in 1942 was tactically brilliant. Its soldiers were brave, disciplined, and highly motivated. But their entire strategy in New Guinea was built on a foundation of logistical fantasy. They believed that superior fighting spirit could overcome the physical realities of terrain, distance, and the basic human need for food. The jungle proved them wrong. It doesn't care about a soldier's honor or his devotion to his emperor. It cares only for calories, for medicine, for a dry place to sleep. The jungle is neutral, and it is ruthlessly impartial. The true victor of the Kokoda campaign was not a general. It was the simple, unforgiving tyranny of the supply line. The Australian victory was ultimately a victory of logistics over ideology. By falling back, they shortened their chain. By advancing, the Japanese stretched theirs until it snapped. Today, thousands of young Australians make the pilgrimage to walk the Kokoda Trail, to tread the same muddy ground where their forefathers fought and died. They do it to remember the sacrifice, to test their own limits, and to connect with a pivotal moment in their nation's history. And as they struggle up those same impossible slopes, they learn firsthand the lesson that General Horii and the South Seas Detachment learned too late. That in any conflict, in any great human endeavor, ambition must be anchored to reality. Courage must be sustained by supplies, and no matter how strong the will to advance, you can only go as far as your supply line will allow. The story of Kokoda is more than just a battle. It is a stark reminder that behind the grand strategies and the tales of heroism, war is often won or lost in the mundane, back-breaking work of getting a can of food and a box of bullets to the front. It is a lesson that echoes from the mountains of New Guinea to the conflicts of the 21st century. This is a piece of history that deserves to be remembered, not just by Australians, but by anyone who wants to understand the true nature of conflict. What do you think is the most overlooked element of the Pacific War? Was it logistics, disease, or something else entirely? Join the discussion in the comments below. And if you believe these stories are important, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more deep dives into the history that shaped our world. Thank you for watching.